Hello, my name's Jock McLaren. I'm a psychiatrist and I've got an interest in applying philosophy of science to psychiatry, but it doesn't always have the results that psychiatrists would like to think that it should have. Quite often the results of my project are a little radical. In fact, we could go so far as to say they are extremely radical, and the major conclusion is that modern psychiatry has no rational or scientific basis. So today in this lecture we're going to be looking at the project called DSM-V. That is the fifth incarnation of the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. I'll be arguing that it is based on extremely poor science, and poor science can only produce poor psychiatry. DSM-V, bad science will not produce good psychiatry. This is a short summary of a paper that will appear in Ethical Human Psychology and Psychiatry later this year, and there's a much longer version which is chapter 6 in the most recent book I've published, which is called Humanizing Psychiatrists. Now, the basis of my stance here is the Popperian injunction that the method of science is bold conjectures and stringent attempts at their refutation. So that says that we have to put up our models and then we have to criticise them. Without criticism, there's no science. What you might have could be religion, it could be politics, metaphysics, or just football, but it's not science. Now, criticism must be institutionalised in the profession, but this has never happened. In fact, it would be very fair to say that the mainstream or establishment psychiatry profession is highly antagonistic to any sort of criticism. They take it intensely personally. And there's general criticism of the DSM project since its inception. That particularly means DSM-3 and 4. Now, the first one, of course, is that it does not address an articulated model of mental disorder. The second one is that no human behaviour distributes categorically. That is to say, all human behaviour blurs right across the landscape, as it were, and without fail, every behaviour described in DSM-IV distributes on a dimensional basis. Essentially, it distributes on a normal or bell-shaped curve. Therefore, the search for a categorical system of diagnosis is void at the outset. So that means that you can't chop mental disorders up into neat categories and think that they say that all there is to say about mental disorder, because every behaviour in DSM-IV in particular distributes dimensionally. And the final criticism is that those categories which have been defined are entirely spurious. They're actually the result of very artful rephrasing of the diagnostic parameters. So my conclusion, which I've published before, is that DSM-IV is non-scientific, and of course DSM-V, which is based on the same propositions, will not evade these criticisms. Now, the DSM-V committee has been in existence for the better part of 10 years or more, and if you go to their website, which is the DSM-V development site, you'll find that it says they've had something like 600 researchers plus an unknown number of support staff labouring for 10 years. And if they each give 10 hours a week, then that amounts to something like 3 million hours. The costs, of course, are unknown because this is owned by the American Psychiatric Association, and that's a private organisation, so they don't have to publish their costs. It's due out in 2013, but there's very little chance that this will happen because the field trials, which are the biggest and most difficult and most expensive part of the whole project, haven't even started. So this has led to unprecedented criticism, and in particular the chairman of the DSM-III and of the DSM-IV task forces, that's Professor Robert Spitzer from Columbia University in New York, and Dr. Alan Francis, who was then at Duke University in North Carolina but has since retired, and they have come out in public and voiced criticisms which says that there must have been an awful lot more went on behind the scenes than we're hearing. They criticised the DSM-V committee on the basis that it's secretive. In fact, members have to sign secrecy contracts. It represents what they call psychiatry unlimited, the notion that we can just keep on spreading the numbers and scope of the diagnoses limitlessly. It's partisan, it's disorganised, it lends itself to fad diagnoses and pseudo-epidemics, And Francis in particular has pointed to the quote, epidemic, unquote, of pediatric bipolar affective disorder. In Australia, the rate of diagnosis of this disorder has gone up something like 8,000% in 20 years, which is completely crazy. They also feel it trivialises mental disorder in that everybody in the world will soon have a diagnosis, if not more. And, of course, it leads to unforeseen consequences. So perhaps in an attempt to get around this, there's been a bit more work this time on trying to define what they mean by a mental disorder. And the paper was published earlier this year in the very prestigious journal Psychological Medicine. The lead author was Professor David Stein, who's at Groote Schuur Hospital in South Africa. And if you have a mind for history, you'll remember, of course, that Groote Schuur was the hospital where the first human cardiac transplant was performed. I think that was about 1967. It's a long time ago now anyway. Two other of the members, so it's Stein, Phillips, Bolton, Sadler, Fulford and Kendler. Two other members are on the DSM-5 working groups, and Professor Bill Fulford is a professor of psychiatry and philosophy, I think at Cambridge University in the UK. Now, so this is a fairly high-powered group, and they are going to attempt to define a mental disorder, but they actually said mental/psychiatric disorder from DSM-IV to DSM-5. I'll have to give a bit of information here in the next two slides. This one just lists the points that they considered are features of a mental disorder, and on the next slide, which is slide 10, they had a list of other considerations. Now we'll go through each of these in more detail. So the features of a mental disorder, they said it's a behavioural or psychological syndrome or pattern that occurs in an individual. Now this is, to my mind, essentially meaningless. For the first point, behavioural and psychological are largely interchangeable, so that sounds good, but in fact it isn't. The syndrome or pattern imposes the requirement that the practitioner find an order in the patient's disturbance, mostly by standing a long way back from him and seeing him not as an individual but as, quote, yet another example of this condition, unquote. Effectively, it invites the psychiatrist to overlook the patient individually and homogenise his life so that he matches the simplified model. Now, the only reason that this could be done is because they're trying to find a biological model. If you're looking to find a psychological syndrome, a syndrome of psychological causation, you'll be looking for the differences, not for the similarities. So right at the beginning, they've presupposed a very, very important question. Is mental disorder psychological or is it biological? I'd say on this basis alone that the DSM project is not scientific, but of course we better give them a few more chances. So point number 2 of their list of features of a mental disorder. Now the consequences of this syndrome or pattern are clinically significant distress or disability. Again, we run into the same pseudo problem that DSM-3 and 4 because nobody can define clinically significant. They often try and get around this by using the word marked. You know, he has marked distress. It's a pity that they didn't look up the dictionary because the word marked doesn't mean very or extremely or a lot. It actually means noted, as in he is a marked man. This is just straight away. Like beauty, clinical significance is in the eye of the beholder, and it's going to be influenced, whether we like it or not, by the patient's wealth and his social status, by the psychiatrist's interests, and of course the psychiatrist's own psychopathology, by the insurer's demands and other matters such as war and disaster, etc. So second feature fails. The third one that they come up with is that it must not be merely an expectable response to common stressors and losses or a culturally sanctioned response to a particular event. This is straight away an implicit admission that the notion of biological basis of categories of mental disorder is spurious, it's false. This feature says that the symptoms will be labelled as a mental disorder not by their nature or their content, but according to their social context. And there's been a very, very detailed criticism of this point by these two authors. Unfortunately, this is a picture I pinched off